I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life I thought I understood people. I could sense lies, spot manipulation, feel when someone was using me. But then I met her. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. The kind of woman who didn't just enter a room, she consumed it. Eyes followed her. Conversations slowed. Even women straightened their posture when she walked past, as if instinctively recognizing a rival. The first time we talked, she didn't flirt, didn't giggle, didn't act cute. She leaned across the bar, locked her eyes on mine, and said, "You look like a man who needs someone to tell him what to do." I should have laughed it off. I should have walked away. But instead, I bought her a drink. Then another. By the end of the night, I was following her like a moth drawn to flame. The first few weeks were intoxicating. She made me feel alive in ways I hadn't felt in years. She pulled me into her chaos. Late-night drives with no destination, expensive dinners I couldn't really afford but paid for anyway, nights of passion that left me both drained and addicted. But the signs were there. The little digs that stung more than they should have. That shirt makes you look cheap. Your friends are boring. Why waste time with them? You're lucky I even tolerate your job. It's pathetic. Always with a smirk. Always with the kind of tone that made me doubt myself. Was she joking? Teasing? Or was she telling me exactly who she was from the start? She controlled with absence as much as with presence. She'd disappear for hours, sometimes entire nights, only to reappear with an easy smile and no explanation. If I asked where she had been, she'd laugh and say, "Don't be so dramatic. You should trust me." If I pressed harder, the laughter would turn sharp. "You're paranoid. That's not attractive." And then, just when I felt like I might walk away, she'd flip the switch. She'd whisper in my ear, hold me like I was the center of her world, remind me of the fire I had fallen into at the beginning. Push, pull, poison, antidote. But lately the balance has shifted. She's not even pretending anymore. She leaves her phone face up, messages lighting the screen with men's names I don't recognize. She comes home late, smelling of cologne that isn't mine, with her lipstick freshly reapplied. When I look at her, she smirks. Why so quiet? Don't you want to ask me where I've been? It's not just cheating. It's cruelty. She wants me to know. She wants me to feel it, to twist myself in knots trying to decide whether to confront her or stay silent. And sometimes in the middle of the night, lying awake beside her while she sleeps like nothing's wrong, I wonder, is she careless? Or is she testing me? Because with her, nothing is ever an accident. The first real crack came on a Wednesday night. She told me she was going out with her friend Mila for dinner. She added plenty of details, as if rehearsed, how Mila just got promoted, how they were going to celebrate, how she might be late. I nodded, kissed her cheek, and told her to have fun. But hours later, when she came home, something didn't add up. Her lipstick was perfect, her dress immaculate. I'd seen Mila before, the kind of friend who'd never stepped foot in an upscale restaurant. But the receipt that slipped out of her purse told me where she'd been, an expensive rooftop bar downtown. 2 glasses of wine. When I laid the receipt on the counter the next morning, she didn't even flinch. She just smirked. "You're going through my things now? Pathetic." "It doesn't match what you told me," I said quietly. She tilted her head, eyes glinting. "Then maybe you remembered wrong. You do that sometimes." Her words burned deeper than any confession. She wasn't just lying. She was rewriting my memory. A few days later, she claimed she was at yoga. Something in her tone made me uneasy, so I drove past the studio. The parking lot was empty. Lights off. No class. That evening, when she came home with her mat in the trunk, humming as if nothing was wrong, I asked, "How was yoga?" She stretched dramatically, smiled, and said, "Exhausting. You should try it sometime." Her eyes lingered on mine, daring me to challenge her. I stayed silent. She leaned in, kissed me softly, and whispered, "Good boy." My stomach twisted. It wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate. The gaslighting grew sharper. One evening, I mentioned her cousin Mark, someone she'd said she met for coffee that afternoon. But later, retelling the story, she slipped. She ordered tea. I raised an eyebrow. "Did you say he?" She laughed, eyes sparkling with mockery. "God, you're paranoid. You really hear what you want, don't you?" Her voice was smooth calm, so convincing that for a moment I doubted myself. Had I misheard? Was I twisting things in my head? And that was the most dangerous part. I could no longer trust my own memory. The worst moment came one Saturday night. She walked into the apartment with a bouquet of roses, not cheap ones but long-stemmed, expensive, carefully wrapped. She placed them in a vase, humming to herself. "Where did those come from?" I asked, my throat dry. "Oh, just leftovers," she said casually. "A co-worker bought too many for his girlfriend and didn't want them to go to waste." She smiled as she adjusted the flowers. "Lucky me, right?" Lucky. That word rang in my head like a curse. Because I knew men don't spend money on roses just to give away extras to a colleague. But when I looked at her, she smirked, leaned close, and whispered, "You're not going to throw a tantrum about this, are you?" That would be so insecure. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every lie was too neat. Every inconsistency too clean. She wasn't hiding her tracks because she didn't need to. She was leaving the evidence behind on purpose. And I finally understood. She wanted me to react. The lies weren't just betrayal. They were bait. I had promised myself I would never stoop so low. I told myself I wouldn't become the kind of man who snoops, who checks phones, who goes digging through drawers like some desperate detective. But she pushed me to that point. The lies weren't sloppy, they were deliberate. The contradictions weren't accidents, they were bait. And the worst part was the way she looked at me every time, with that sly little smirk, as if to say, "Go ahead, take the bait. Show me how weak you are." That night, I lay awake beside her, listening to her slow, steady breathing. She slept like an angel while I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the last few weeks. The perfume, the receipts, the flowers. None of it matched, and she didn't care. She wanted me to see. She wanted me to break. And that thought twisted inside me until I finally sat up, reached over to the nightstand, and picked up her phone. Her passcode was her birthday reversed. I'd seen her type it 100 times. My hands were shaking as I entered the digits. The screen lit up, and suddenly the truth was in front of me. I opened her messages. My chest tightened. It wasn't Mila. It wasn't Katia. It wasn't even Mark. There were threads upon threads, each one with a different man's name. Daniel, Pavel, Ivan. Some were saved with nothing but initials. Others had emojis next to them, hearts, flames, smirking faces. My stomach dropped as I scrolled. One message made me feel physically sick. "He's getting suspicious. But it's fun. He won't leave me. He's too weak." And her reply, "Of course he won't. He needs me more than I need him. I think he likes the pain." My hands trembled as I scrolled further. There were photos, not explicit but enough. Her at restaurants with them, leaning in too close. Drinks at bars, her smile too intimate. Always different men. Always the same game. I should have felt rage. I should have shaken her awake and demanded answers. But all I felt was hollow. Empty. Because deep down I had known. Seeing it laid out in front of me wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation of the nightmare I had already been living in. I put the phone back exactly where I found it and lay down again, staring at the ceiling. She stirred, turned toward me, pressed herself against my chest like nothing was wrong. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Around 3 in the morning, half asleep, she whispered something that made my blood run cold. "You'll never leave me. You need me too much." I froze. Did she know I had looked? Or was it just another perfectly timed dagger, planted to pierce me in the dark? The next morning, she was her radiant self again. Making coffee, humming, moving through the apartment as if she hadn't just shattered me the night before. I watched her, my mind replaying that whisper over and over. Later that day, I searched further. Not just her phone this time. Her purse. Her desk. The drawer she always kept locked. Inside, I found a slim black notebook. My hand shook as I opened it. It wasn't a diary. It was a log. Notes about me. Confronted me about perfume. Denied. Reaction. Frustrated but apologetic. Good. Tested with Mila. He hesitated, doubted himself. Perfect. Next step. Mention Daniel at dinner. Watch his eyes. Page after page. My life, my suspicions, my confusion, all neatly catalogued in her careful handwriting. I wasn't her boyfriend. I was her experiment. I sat there in her chair, the notebook open in my lap, my pulse thundering in my ears. I thought back to every time she smirked at me, every time she called me paranoid, every time she whispered in the dark. None of it was random. None of it was careless. She had been engineering my downfall piece by piece, testing, observing, recording. When I heard the door unlock downstairs, I shoved the notebook back into the drawer and closed it softly. She walked in moments later, her eyes scanning me instantly like always, searching for cracks. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and asked, "You look tired." "Long day." I forced a smile. "Yeah, just work." She poured herself a glass of wine, sat across from me, and tilted her head, studying me like a scientist studying a subject in a cage. Then she smiled that cold, sharp smile and said, "You know, sometimes I think you'd completely fall apart without me. And part of me wants to see it happen." She sipped her wine, never breaking eye contact, and I realized with a sick certainty this wasn't carelessness. It wasn't even betrayal anymore. Every lie, every slip, every test was intentional. She wanted to watch me unravel. And the only question left in my mind was how far she was planning to take it before she decided the experiment was over. I told myself I would be calm. I promised I would not hand her the satisfaction of a meltdown, of the scene she was clearly craving. The whole of every night for weeks had been spent rehearsing what I would say, not to accuse, but to demand honesty, to cut the lie out clean. I pictured walking into the kitchen, laying the phone and the notebook down like evidence on a courthouse table, and watching her flinch. That fantasy lasted about as long as it took to stand up. Real life has a way of being messier than the endings you rehearse. When she came in that night, late and smelling faintly of another man's cologne, she moved like she owned the hour. She kicked off her heels with the careless grace of someone who knows the world tips toward her anyway. I sat at the table with her phone face down beside my empty glass and the black notebook folded in my lap. My hands felt heavy. For a second, a ridiculous, small instant, my mouth went dry and my throat closed. But then I breathed, stood up, and said her name like a statement. She turned, expression pleasant, a little too polished. "Hi," she said. "Everything okay?" I put the phone on the table and slid the notebook across, so it stopped right under her hand. "Tell me about last Saturday," I said, voice steady, stripped of accusation. "Who did you have dinner with on the rooftop? Who sent the roses?" She looked down at the pages, then up at me, and I thought I saw the tiniest flicker of something, surprise, amusement, and then her smile smoothed back into place. "Oh," she said lightly, as if we were discussing the weather, "what a strange question." I held her gaze. "Don't play games. I found receipts, messages. I found your notebook." Her smile brightened, as though I'd paid her a compliment. "You looked through my things," she said, not angry, only delighted, as if I'd entertained her like a clever child. How quaint. That was when she did what she always did best. She turned it. She leaned forward like she was leaning in to whisper, some secret I'd crawl over broken glass to hear. "You know," she murmured, "people who go through others' phones, they usually find what they expect. They find evidence of their own insecurities." She tapped the notebook with a manicured finger. "You must be so lonely that you have to make yourself small by checking other people." The words were soft, almost tender. The venom came after. "You can keep your little trophies, love. But remember, if you make a scene, if you start accusing, if you try to humiliate me, who do you think will be believed? The man tearing apart a woman's things at midnight, or the composed girlfriend who goes to work and volunteers at the animal shelter on weekends?" She listed it like a litany, calm and precise, as if reciting items to support a legal case. I felt something hot and animal rise in my chest, a call to roar. Instead, I sat down. I felt tears I couldn't let fall press behind my eyelids. I had not counted on how quickly the world would tilt to her favor when I broke protocol. The notebook in my lap suddenly felt very small, very useless in the face of her practiced charm. She watched me, satisfied. "You've always been dramatic," she said. "Do you really think this is the first time someone has noticed? People are complicated. We make choices." She folded her hands in front of her, like a model posed for a magazine. "But if you tell anyone you've been snooping, if you shout this from the rooftops, the story you tell will sound like the story of someone losing his mind. That's not good for either of us, is it?" Her words were a trap and a promise. In one breath, she painted herself as the reasonable one, the hurt party, the vulnerable soul mistaken for confident, and me as the unstable intruder. She made me a caricature with a few flicks of her wrist. I had no retort. I had no audience. The apartment seemed to tilt toward her, and she fed on that shift like a creature, inhaling. I tried another approach. I took a breath and spoke quietly. "This is about respect. It's about truth. You either tell me what happened, or we end this cleanly." The clean ending I imagined was small and unromantic, but at least finite. She laughed then, a sound I no longer recognized, loud and sharp and without apology. "Clean," she mocked, "is for people who don't understand nuance." She reached across, trace my jaw with a finger that felt like cool glass. And as for truth, her voice became a syrupy lullaby. Truth is complicated, especially when one mind is so eager to decide for another. There it was, the arrogance I'd seen from the start, doubled now with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed the defense. She had friends at the bar at work, women who'd testify to her kindness. She had my mother's neighbor who'd once borrowed sugar and now adored her. She had 100 small social proofs stacked like bricks around her. Me? I had a black notebook and a phone screen full of messages. She had something better, a narrative. The worst part was how calmly she had pivoted my evidence into proof of my obsession. It was textbook. It was theatrical. She had told 1,000 versions of a story in her head and picked the one with the best lighting. I left the apartment that night without a scene, without a confession, without a plea. I walked out in the dark and felt smaller than I had imagined possible, not because I'd lost her, but because I'd been convinced the world would side with her if I raised my voice. Outside, under the sodium lights that made the street look tired, I sat on a curb and let the cold air cut my face. I realized then that confronting her had been a mistake, not because she hadn't deserved it, but because she'd made me the villain in every tale where a man shows weakness. She had not merely prepared counters. She had built a fortress of sympathizers, of plausible deniability, of ready-made stories to tell investigators and friends. I thought of the notebook, of the words she'd written like tally marks next to dates, recording the cadence of my reactions. I thought of the message that had said so casually and cruelly, "He's getting suspicious. But it's fun." I thought of the strange exhilaration she'd shown when I broke inside her grip. She had wanted a show. I'd given her one. Now I had to become smarter than the actor she expected. That night, I didn't go home right away. I walked until my legs ached, until my phone battery was low, and I couldn't even scroll through old messages to make sense of a life I once trusted. I called one person my oldest friend, and I spoke in fragments, not revealing everything, just enough that someone outside her orbit knew I wasn't the monster she'd make me out to be. He listened, and without judgment, he said, "Be careful. Don't hand her the script." That was the phrase that stuck. Don't hand her the script. If I'd handed it to her by confronting her, then she would direct the scene. I had to retreat from the open stage and build my case in the dark. I had to stop feeding her audience. I had to stop believing that truth alone would be enough. She had engineered the world to reward the performance, not the facts. So I went home and with shaking hands, I emptied the contents of the notebook into my phone. Photos, scans, voice notes. I made copies and hid them in places she would never think to look. A safety deposit box at the bank, a friend's email account, a thumb drive in an old toolbox at my brother's workshop. I stopped wearing my heart on my sleeve and learned to wear a face instead. Pleasant, foolishly devoted, unthreatening. I became the man she wanted to see because outwardly he was harmless. Privately, I was accumulating proof, patience, and alliances. Confrontation had taught me one thing. She was ready for anything. She had rehearsed for my anger, for my tears, for every scene she could imagine. The only way to win was not to meet her on the well-lit stage she'd built, but to outlast her in the shadows she neglected. And so I turned my anger into strategy, my shame into quiet preparation. The game had changed, and now the rules belonged to me. After that night, I realized confronting her head-on was useless. She had prepared for it. She had turned my evidence into proof of my obsession, my anger into her defense, my pain into her performance. If I gave her more, she would twist it. If I shouted, she would call me unstable. If I broke, she would smile. So I made a choice, no more feeding her story. From that day forward, I became someone else. I was polite, pleasant, predictable. I smiled when she walked in late with perfume clinging to her dress. I nodded when her phone lit up with names I'd never seen. I even asked about them casually, as though I didn't care. Who's Daniel? Who's Pavel? Oh, that's nice. She searched my eyes for jealousy, for fury, but found nothing. And that terrified her, because her power didn't come from secrets. It came from my reactions. Without my anger, her lies were just words. Without my rage, her perfume was just a scent in the air. But I wasn't idle. Behind the mask, I was working. Every receipt I found, I photographed. Every late-night whisper I overheard, I recorded. I scanned her notebook page by page, every cruel little line she wrote about testing me and breaking me. I made copies and stored them far from her reach, a cloud account under a different name, a USB at my brother's workshop, even a safety deposit box at the bank. If she wanted a game, I was building a rulebook of my own. It didn't take long for her to notice the shift. One night she came home with roses, dropped them on the counter, and said, "A colleague gave me these. Aren't you curious who?" I smiled and replied, "They're beautiful. Let's put them in water." Her jaw tightened. For the first time, her mask cracked. Another night, she left a man's watch on the dresser. When I picked it up, she waited for me to explode. Instead, I placed it neatly beside her purse and said nothing. She snapped, "You don't even care anymore, do you?" I looked her in the eye and said softly, "Not about games." That was when I knew the balance was shifting. She thrived on chaos, on drama, on pulling strings to make me dance. But I had cut the strings myself. And with every day that I stayed calm, she grew more restless, more desperate. At night, I overheard her on the phone, her voice low and frustrated. "He doesn't react to anything. I've tried everything. It's like he's not even there." Then a pause. "It's boring now." I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her frustration spilling into the dark. For the first time in months, I smiled. Because in her voice, I heard it clearly, she was losing. She had always believed she owned the script. Every sigh, every smile, every mistake was designed to draw out my reaction, to confirm the story she had already written for me. For years, I gave it to her. My anger, my jealousy, my doubts, they were the fuel for her fire. But when I stopped reacting, when I smiled instead of snapping, when I answered her lies with silence, something inside her cracked. At first, she tried harder. She paraded her provocations like trophies. Men's names flashing on her phone, perfumes that weren't hers, lipstick smudged in ways she thought I couldn't miss. She would pause, waiting, her eyes fixed on mine, hungry for the explosion. But I gave her nothing. And each time I didn't play along, her mask slipped just a little more. One night, she came home with a stranger's scarf around her neck. She tossed it on the chair deliberately, almost theatrically, then leaned against the wall with her arms folded. "Well," she said, tilting her head. "Nothing to say." I glanced at the scarf, then back at her. "Nice color," I said, and returned to my book. Her face twisted for a moment before she forced the smile back on. A few days later, she brought home a bouquet of expensive flowers and set them right in the middle of the table. "Someone gave me these," she said. "Don't you want to know who?" I smiled faintly. "They're beautiful. Let's put them in a vase." She slammed the vase down so hard the water spilled across the table. "You don't even care," she shouted. "Do I mean nothing to you anymore?" I looked at her calmly. "Not when you're playing games." For the first time, she had no reply. Just silence, her chest heaving as she stared at me. That night, I heard her in the kitchen on the phone, her voice low and sharp. "He doesn't react," she hissed. "I've tried everything. Nothing works. He just stays calm." Pause. "It's boring now." I lay in bed, listening, my hands folded behind my head. For months, I had been her subject, her experiment. Now, I had starved her of what she needed most. And in her frustration, I realized something powerful. She wasn't in control anymore. She was unraveling. But that realization came with a warning. Because when someone like her loses control, when the strings she's been pulling suddenly go slack, she doesn't just give up. She escalates. She becomes dangerous. And I knew the next move she made wouldn't be another perfume stain or a fake story. The next move would be war. Her silence didn't last long. I knew it wouldn't. She couldn't survive without the chaos, without feeding off my reactions. And when I denied her that fuel, she grew restless, dangerous. The mask of control that had once seemed so perfect began to crack, and beneath it I saw something raw, something feral. It was only a matter of time before she struck back, and when she did, it was with precision. One evening, I came home from work and found 2 police officers standing outside my door. My stomach twisted before they even spoke. Their questions were polite, almost casual, but every one of them was sharpened like a blade. Did I and my girlfriend argue often? Had there been raised voices? Had I ever broken anything in anger? Did I ever feel out of control? I answered calmly, firmly, but I could see the doubt already etched into their faces. Someone had planted the seed. Someone had given them a story to test. And I didn't need to ask who. When they finally left, I turned and saw her in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee, that innocent smile painted across her lips. She tilted her head, locked her eyes on me, and mouthed 2 words I'll never forget: "Your turn." It wasn't anger in her eyes. It wasn't fear. It was amusement. She was enjoying herself. She had dragged outsiders into the game, expanded the stage, and now she wanted to see how I would perform. That night at dinner, she didn't bother hiding the venom anymore. "You know," she said, sipping her wine, "all it takes is a few phone calls. And suddenly, no one listens to your side. People believe me. They always do." She said it casually, like commenting on the weather, but the threat was clear. I stared at her across the candlelight, and for the first time I saw her not as a partner, not even as an enemy, but as a predator who had spent months fattening me up with confusion, and now wanted to devour me completely. I realized then this wasn't just about manipulation or betrayal anymore. This was war. She wasn't satisfied with breaking me behind closed doors. She wanted to destroy me publicly, socially, legally. And if I didn't move first, she would end me. So I went to the office that night, long after she had gone to bed, and unlocked the safe where I kept everything. The recordings of her late-night calls where she bragged about pushing me until I cracked. The notebook where she logged my reactions like a scientist measuring a lab rat. The photos of her with other men, her messages mocking me. I spread them out across my desk, page after page, each one a piece of her mask stripped away. My hands were steady now. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt calm. These weren't just memories of pain anymore. They were weapons. When I locked the safe again and walked back out into the cold night air, I understood something vital. She had written her script, yes. She had built her stage and cast me as the paranoid fool, the jealous wreck. But I didn't have to play her part anymore. I had my own story now, my own evidence, my own voice. And when the time came, it wouldn't be her laughter echoing in the dark. It would be her silence. After the night the police came, I knew something fundamental had shifted. The game had gone public. It was no longer just her against me in our apartment. She had dragged the world into it. The walls that once felt like a stage for her little experiments now felt like prison bars closing in. She had expanded the battlefield, and I could feel the danger pressing in from every side. But something inside me had changed too. The fear that once twisted in my stomach had burned itself out. What replaced it was cold, steady resolve. If she wanted war, then I would fight, not with shouting or scenes, but with silence, patience, and proof. She didn't try to hide her contempt anymore. She wanted me to see it. She wanted me to feel it. One evening she came home late, her perfume so strong it hit me before the door even closed. She set her phone on the table face up, the screen lighting the room. A man's name flashed across it, not one I recognized, with a string of heart emojis. She didn't reach for the phone, didn't bother to lock it. She just poured herself wine, sat down across from me, and let the screen glow between us like a neon sign. "Strange," she said finally, her voice light, her eyes sharp. "You don't even ask anymore. Not curious where I've been, not curious who that is." She gestured casually toward the phone, her smile faint and mocking. "Maybe you should be. Maybe the neighbors are. Maybe the police will be again. Maybe next time I'll tell them you've been scaring me." Her words hung heavy in the air, carefully chosen, each one a knife aimed at my composure. I lifted my glass, took a sip, and smiled faintly. "Long day at work," I said quietly, ignoring her bait. Her smile flickered, then sharpened again. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, studying me like she was looking for cracks in the armor. "You've changed," she whispered. "You used to care. You used to get angry. Now you just sit there." I met her gaze, calm, unblinking. Maybe I learned. That answer seemed to throw her off. She tilted her head, smirked again, but I could see it in her eyes, the first flash of doubt. She wasn't used to me holding my ground. She tried harder. The next night, she walked in with a stranger's scarf around her neck. A man's scarf. She draped it over the chair, as if to say, "Look, ask me about it." I didn't. The night after, she brought home roses, long-stemmed, expensive, still wrapped in the florist's paper. She placed them in the center of a table and smiled like a child showing off a trophy. "Someone gave me these," she said. "Don't you want to know who?" I looked at the flowers, then at her. "They're beautiful," I said. "Let's put them in water." Her smile cracked. She slammed the vase on the table, so hard water splashed across the wood. "You don't even care," she shouted. "Do I mean nothing to you anymore?" I stayed calm, my voice even. "Not when you're just playing games." Her face twisted, her eyes burning with fury. For the first time, she had no script. No rehearsed laugh, no polished line. Just silence. That night, I heard her on the phone again. Her voice wasn't playful anymore. It was sharp, frustrated, almost desperate. He doesn't react, she hissed. I've tried everything. Nothing works. He just stays calm. A pause. Then her voice dropped bitter and low. It's boring now. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to her words cut through the dark. And for the first time in months, I smiled to myself. Because in that one sentence, I heard it clearly. She was losing. But I also knew something else, something darker. A woman like her, someone who thrived on control, who fed on chaos, didn't just walk away when the game stopped working. No. When the tricks failed, when the mask cracked, when the experiment no longer delivered results, she escalated. She became dangerous. And as I lay there in the quiet, her frustrated words echoing in my ears, I realized the perfume, the flowers, the scarf, none of it mattered anymore. Those were just sparks. The real fire was coming. I knew she would make another move. She always did. For months, she had trained me to expect the hit, to live in anticipation of her lies, her traps, her poison disguised as charm. But this time I was ready. I had my folder, my recordings, my copies hidden away where she'd never find them. And then she struck, exactly the way I knew she would. It happened on a Tuesday night. She came home late, as usual, humming as she set her purse on the table. Her phone lit up with a message from a man's name I didn't recognize. She let it sit there, glowing between us like a test. She poured herself a drink, leaned on the counter, and said with that smug little smirk, "Funny how you don't ask questions anymore. Maybe you're too scared of the answers." I smiled faintly, picked up my glass, and said nothing. Her smirk faltered. She pushed harder. "Do you want to know where I was?" "No," I said calmly. "Because I already know." That stopped her. Just for a second. Then her smile returned, sharper now. "Oh, really? Enlighten me. I'd love to hear this fantasy." I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope. Thick. Heavy. I placed it on the table between us and slid it across the wood until it rested by her hand. She raised an eyebrow, opened it slowly, and pulled out the pages. Her own words stared back at her. The transcript of her late-night phone call. "He's calmer now. Next week we'll have enough. I'll file and it'll be clean." Her notebook entries, scanned line by line, tested him with perfume. Reaction weak. Mention Daniel next. Gauge jealousy. And finally the photos. Her with the men she thought I'd never know about. Her smiles, her hands, her eyes betraying everything. She flipped through them, her face perfectly still. No laugh. No smirk. Just silence. Finally, she looked up at me. Her voice was soft, almost tender. "So you've been keeping score?" I leaned back, steady. "No. I've been surviving." Her lips curved into a small, dangerous smile. "And what do you think this proves? That I had drinks? That I laughed? That I vented on the phone? All it shows is that you've been spying, snooping, obsessed. If you tell anyone, I'll say you're paranoid. And they'll believe me." I met her gaze. "Maybe, but what they'll believe more is your own voice." I pressed play on my phone. Her laugh filled the room, that cruel, gleeful sound. "He'll crack soon. I can't wait to see it." The sound cut through the air like glass. She froze. For the first time in months, she looked rattled. She tried to recover. She laughed, but it was brittle, hollow. "So what?" I was joking. "People vent. It means nothing." I leaned forward, my voice low and even. "It means everything. Because now, your story isn't mine versus yours. It's yours versus yours. And you can't win that." Her eyes narrowed. She pushed the papers back across the table, stood up, and paced the room. "You think you're clever," she hissed. "You think you've turned this around. But you haven't won. You'll never win. You're still mine." I shook my head. "Not anymore. You wanted me to be paranoid, unstable, broken. But you went too far. You left too many traces. And now, the only unstable one in this room is you." She stopped pacing and turned to me, her eyes burning. "You won't use it," she said, voice trembling with rage. "You don't have the guts." I stood, picked up the envelope, and slid it back into my bag. "I already have. Copies are out there. Safe. Even if I disappeared tomorrow, your mask would crumble." Her face twisted. For the first time, she had no line, no defense. Just silence. That night, we didn't speak. She sat in the dark, sipping wine, staring at me with eyes that promised fire. I sat calm, steady, unflinching. For months, she had studied me, tested me, written me down like an experiment. But in the end, she was the one under the microscope. She was the one whose lies, whose words, whose laughter were being catalogued. And I think she finally realized it. The hunter had become the hunted. After sliding that envelope across the table, after watching her fingers tremble over her own handwriting and the recordings she thought were private, something in the apartment finally changed tone. The little rituals that used to belong to her, the practiced tilt of her head, the rehearsed laugh, the way she'd smooth a napkin with 2 fingers as if composing a photograph, all of it felt brittle now, like porcelain in a room that had been cracked. She tried to rebuild herself immediately. She put on the armor of composure, arranged her hair until not a strand betrayed her, poured wine into 2 glasses, and carried them to the table as if we were the same couple who had once celebrated anniversaries and small domestic triumphs. "We can still handle this quietly," she said, voice low, the exact tone that could make anyone forget an ugly truth. But the words landed flat. They were thinner than they used to be, worn-out lines from a rehearsal she'd run too many times. I watched her the way you watch someone who has been famous for hurting people and is now suddenly footnote-sized. There was a flicker, not of guilt, I don't think, but a calculation, about what to say next, how to spin this so the needle on sympathy might swing back in her favor. She picked up a photo, smoothed it between her fingers, and for a second her eyes were something like regret. Then she swallowed it and put the mask back. "You could have come to me," she said. "You could have asked. But instead you built a dossier. You think legal papers are truth? People believe what's simpler. They choose sides." There was judgment in her words, an attempt to lecture. I felt none of the old pleading. I felt only the quiet weight of a man who had spent too many nights cataloging small cruelties and who had finally decided to keep the ledger. "I didn't want to make you small," I said. "I wanted you to stop making me small." My voice was steady, not triumphant, not vengeful, just precise. She blinked, surprised that I had lost the tremble she used to incite. "You wanted to watch me break. You wanted witnesses. I found witnesses of my own." She laughed once, but it bounced off the walls. "So what now? You'll file? You'll press charges? You'll tell everyone?" Her mouth worked as if tasting the idea, testing whether the sound might triangularly turn the room back into her theater. She had practiced that maneuver, make the threatened man look like the aggressor by threatening the folk legal recourse. It had worked before. It wouldn't now. "Not because I want to humiliate you," I answered. "Because I want to be safe. Because I don't want someone who studies pain for pleasure to have the keys to my life." She set her glass down with a sharper sound than she intended. For a moment the old ferocity burned through, the woman who could command the mood in a room and bend people subconsciously. "You'll ruin me," she whispered. "You'll make me the villain in a story where I'm the only one who ever tried." But I had already stopped believing her stories years ago. The irony, if there was one, was that she had done the work for me. She had recorded and written and laughed and planned. Her confession existed in ink and audio and in born foolishness. She had made the map that led out of the maze she had built. The next days were procedural and delicate. I met my lawyer in a small office where the light came in straight and neutral through a dusty window. We went through the files, the notebooks, the timestamps, the photos, the call logs, the transcribed whispers. He told me, in that calm professional voice, what I already suspected: the pattern would speak for itself to someone outside the orbit of her charisma. We prepared affidavits, we arranged secure backups, and we decided on a careful, legal first move. When I told her, not publicly, not theatrically, but quietly, a fact delivered like a notice, she did what she always did when the public could be a jury. She smiled big, too big. "Do it," she said. "Then everyone will see what a monster you are." Except now the words had no teeth. Even when she tried to spin outrage and bewilderment, there were small fissures. A former friend texted me a cautious question instead of the automatic defense I'd expected from her inner circle. Someone in the book club, who had once lined up compliments like rosary beads for her, hesitated at the edges of the story. It felt like a small army of small truths suddenly aligning. She kept moving through the apartment like a queen marking territory, a chapter of our lives staged to show that she could not be diminished. But the room did not obey her the way it once had. People she'd relied on for quick validation started to ask gentle questions. Not everyone turned away, not everyone turned wholly to me either. It was messy like a real life. but it was no longer the clean, unilateral script she preferred. There came a morning when she packed a bag. It was precise and swift, as if she had choreographed the exit the way she choreographed everything else, planned, practiced, empty of surprise. She murmured a few words about needing space and time. There was no pleading, no dramatic door slam. I watched her fold the last of her clothes into an expensive, utilitarian suitcase, and felt no urge to stop her. There was weirdly a hollow relief. The apartment exhaled in my ears, the kind of breath that says a danger has left the room. She paused at the door, hand on the knob. She looked at me, her eyes searching for the old man she could have bent into apology or rage. "You'll miss me," she said, with that same confident cruelty that used to be the center of our universe. "You think you'll be strong without me? Wait until the silence finds you." I watched her go. The door shut softly behind her. For a while the apartment hummed with silence that was not empty. It was the quiet of a place that had been scraped clean. I sat at the table where the dossiers had once lain, where our voices had once collided, and I felt something like peace. It wasn't a fireworks victory. It was a slow, surrendered breath that followed a long fight. The world outside continued to rustle with gossip and small sympathies and the mundane work of people living complicated lives. Her neighbors said later that she had moved quickly to a new address. A mutual friend posted something oblique and then deleted it. My inbox filled with 1 or 2 curt messages, some tribes left over from our life, others practical and cold. The legal wheels spun carefully without spectacle. The purpose was not to ruin, but to protect and to create a buffer between what had been and what could be. Months later, on an unremarkable afternoon, I found myself making tea in an empty apartment. The kettle whistled. For a moment, I considered leaving evidence of the past under a folder in the desk, then thought better of it. I had learned something vital. Evidence could topple falsehood, courts could adjudicate facts, but the real victory was quieter. It was waking up without the sharp little noises that once made me lurch, the clink of a glass at odd hours, the scent of cologne that used to make my chest tighten. It was recognizing that survival is not the same as triumph, and that reclaiming oneself begins with a small, stubborn refusal to become someone else's entertainment. Sometimes I would catch myself scanning a room, cataloging minor betrayals like metaphors. Old reflexes took a minute to die out, but they did. Time did its patient work. Her absence, which once threatened to hollow me, turned into ordinary days that I learned to fill with steady work and singular, unglamorous acts of kindness toward myself. Grocery shopping on a quiet Sunday, paying bills on time, calling my brother just to hear his voice. The ledger of pain I had kept folded up and stored where it couldn't haunt me every morning. The files existed, legal and ready, but they were no longer the center of my world. Sometimes when the sky was the pale blue of late autumn, and the city moved like a sleepier animal, I thought of her. I pictured her in some other apartment, setting the stage for someone new. A flicker of sympathy brightened for a second, not for the woman who'd played with me, but for the person who had made a life on other people's reactions. Then the thought went. I had my life back. The silent hours belonged to me now. In the end, there was no dramatic courtroom showdown televised in the living room, no cinematic confession where she collapsed at my knees and asked for forgiveness. That would have fit neatly into the kinds of stories I'd once wanted to star in. Real life, however, is messier and quieter. The victory was small and stubborn and utterly mine. I stopped being the man she could predict. I stopped turning around whenever the script demanded it. Survival had nothing to do with dramatic proofs. It had everything to do with the low, everyday choices of reclaiming a life, one open-eyed, ordinary morning at a time.